Good afternoon. My name is Graham Finley with Grant Thornton, here to present our regular oversight report. And I'll hit the high points in the interest of time. So we're maintaining our overall rating on the project of Yellow Plus, which in our lexicon means that there are some material risks to the project, but the project team has plans in place to address them. So in summary, and I think as you've heard, the project is on schedule and on budget, and there's been a successful rollout of the soft launch, and I think I'll concur on the comments on the demonstrations. I think they've achieved what we'd hoped they would have achieved, and it's been, I think, a good thing for the project as a whole, both in terms of the confidence perspective and the user perspective, as well as providing some additional testing before you get to official testing, because there's a lot of work it created on the backside to make these things go as smoothly as they did. If there are a couple of areas of risk that we'd want to draw attention to, I say that the main two areas are one in the area of scope, and I think Prashant pointed out that the FR3 negotiations were completed, successfully. We talked about that in our last meeting. So now there's a similar set of negotiations underway around FR2. And that's probably the biggest sort of question around scope for the project right now. So we're looking forward to those being completely negotiated on a successful basis in a timely manner, so we can lock down the scope and schedule for FR2. The other area of potential risk that we've been tracking is in the resources dimension. And really, there have been two pieces to this. One has been a couple of key roles that have been open or have had acting individuals on the project. One is the co-lead for the business core team, and then the other, of course, is the business sponsor. So we have individuals who have been identified for both of those, and we're looking forward to seeing a successful transition into those roles. The second dimension around resources is really the challenge that in particular, the business team staff at CalSTRS having in meeting all the concurrent demands on their time. And so actually Prashant and Melissa have been working together on, you can almost think of it as a supply-demand management process where the project forecasts what they're going to need from the business side over a certain number of months ahead, and that enables the business team to figure out who they need to have support that and then balance that with their ongoing operational demand. And that's a really important process to get worked out. And so that's something that Prashant and Melissa have been working on, and we're looking forward to seeing that getting honed. So those are probably the two main areas we're looking at right now. In terms of our focus between now and the January board meeting, one obviously is the rollout of the employee readiness activities for soft launch, and Melissa showed pretty effectively what's planned there. Then there's the resource management piece that I just talked about, so the transition for some of these key roles, and then the ability to forecast accurately the need for business personnel through functional release 2 and showing that the business team is able to meet those demands. We're going to continue to look at the identification of business benefits and success measures, particularly as we're thinking about balancing operational activity during go live with the business results that the project is looking to obtain. And then finally, and probably in the near term, maybe the most urgent, resolving the ongoing negotiations around FR2 and the change request there, so we can lock down the scope and schedule for the remainder of FR2. So those are our main focus areas, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in January. I'll take any questions.
Any questions from committee members? I don't see any. So thanks so much. Thanks for the update.
Thank you.
And I'm glad we have a live eye on the board on what's going on, Karen. I'm so glad you're able to.
And this sheet really helps out a lot. I really appreciate all the information.
I think the placemats have been a real winner. Yeah. I think it's just a really great visual way to capture everything. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah. No. They're big.
Good. Thank you. All right. I think we have Julie and Art. We're going to go over basic financial statements.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we've got 20 minutes allocated for this. Oh, darn. Okay. No worries. That's okay.
So, Madam Chair, members of the board, Julie Underwood, Chief Financial Officer, and I'm here today with Benki Fatula.
That's not Art.
It's not Art. We switched it up a little bit.
That's all right.
Benki is our Senior Financial Reporting Manager, and him and his team do a lot of significant work, along with working with other staff throughout the organization to prepare our financial statements. We are presenting a review of CalSTRS basic financial statements as of June 30, 2019. And as discussed yesterday in the ARM committee, our financial statements were audited by our independent auditor, Crowe. and they did issue an unqualified opinion on our financial statements. And that means that they are free of material misstatements and presented fairly in all material respects. So very good news.
That's great news. Excellent.
Now, I also wanted to share that we received from the Government Finance Officers Association a Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting for our June 30, 2018 CAFR.
Are we gonna have to build like a glass
Oh,
display
oh,
case
yes.
in the lobby, I think?
Well, wait, I'm not done.
Okay, I'll let you
I'll be in the hallway.
go. Apparently a larger one.
I have another one.
Okay.
We received an award for Outstanding Achievement in Popular Annual Financial Reporting for our 2018 PAFR.
Popular, I was gonna say.
Some more information on those two awards are included in Jack's CEO report in item number 11. But again, I wanted to take the opportunity
Excellent.
to thank all the staff that worked so hard to put together our financial reports, and they are award-winning. So thank you, staff, for
Wow.
everything that you do.
Start saying that on the next item.
Well deserved.
Okay, so now Benki will present to you an overview of our financial statements.
Great.
So just to, piggyback on discussion around the award, we do have somewhat of a walk of the stars right next to Julie's
I like
office
it.
with all the plaques and
Great.
stuff,
We'll
so
have to come up and check it
we are
out.
proud of those achievements. So I'll be going through the financial statements, and if you would just turn with me as I go through the document. So the financial statements consist of management's discussion and analysis, the basic financial statement and related note disclosures, required supplementary information, and other supplementary information. So the management's discussion analysis, or the MDA, starts on TRB 122. And this is an introduction to CalSTR's basic financial statements. It, in a sense, provides an objective and easily readable analysis of CalSTR's financial activities during the fiscal year. It's followed by the basic financial statements, which start on TRB 140. So if you would turn with me to TRB 140, you'll see here, and I realize there's a lot of information on this page, but you'll see here that it displays a statement of fiduciary net position, which essentially serves as the balance sheet for CalSTRS. And what this report shows are the assets and liabilities of the system, with the differences displayed as fiduciary net position. And if you would look to the bottom right section of the page, you'll note that CalSTR's net position as of June 30, 2019 was approximately $240 billion. And this reflects an increase of approximately $14.2 billion, or 6% from the prior year. And the main driver for the increase in this figure are the net investment gains on the system's investment assets. But also, another contributing factor to the growth are the increases in contributions. And if you turn to TRB 141 on the following page, you'll note the statement of changes in fiduciary net position, which shows all the changes in net position during the fiscal year. And again, if you would look at the right section of the page, you can see contributions were approximately $14.8 billion for the fiscal year. And this was an increase from the prior year of $3.5 billion. And the main driver of that was the state supplemental contributions of approximately $2.2 billion as part of the enactment of Senate Bill 90. And I would like to note that although we didn't receive those funds, the actual cash or the funds within fiscal year 18-19, we did recognize them as contributions because under the accounting guidance, because the state had made a legal commitment by enacting the law during fiscal year 18-19, we were required to record them as contributions in that year. And other reasons for increases in contributions include increases in active membership, as well as increased credible compensation and the increased contribution rates under CalSTR's funding plan. So pause if there's any questions at this point. Okay. If you would turn to, TRB 142, just the next page over, 143. Or 143, pardon me. This section shows this section is actually, pardon me, it is 142. But this is the beginning of the notes to the basic financials. And what the notes to the basic financials does is it provides additional information that's essential to understanding the statements of fiduciary net position and the statements of changes in fiduciary net position. On TRB 143, we have some membership data, and it shows that we had approximately 960,000 members as of June 30, members, retirees, and beneficiaries as of June 30, 2019. Turning over to TRB TRB 146. It displays the contribution rates for members, employers, and the state. And on TRB 154, we disclose information on the net pension liability of the state teachers' retirement plan. As of June 30, 2019, the NPL, or the net pension liability, was $90.3 billion. One thing to note is that this liability is not actually reported on our balance sheet. We don't record it on our financial statements. It's reported on each employer's financial statement as well as the state's financial statement, because under the accounting guidance, they're required to recognize their proportionate share of the liability. And if you look at the next page on TRB 155, Note 4 discloses information on the net other post-employment benefit liability. And what this liability relates to is the Medicare Premium Payment Program. And the liability as of June 30, 2019 was $372.4 million. And again, just like the NPL, this liability is not recorded on our financial statements. Each employer reports their proportionate share of this liability. Moving on to TRB 157, we disclose information on the money-weighted return of CalSTRS, which for the fiscal year was 6.6%. This rate measures the performance of the pension plan's investment portfolio, taking into account the effects of transactions that increase pension plan investments, such as contributions, as well as those that decrease the pension plan investments, such as benefit payments. Now, you note that this is different from the rate that's disclosed by the investment branch of 6.8 for the fiscal year 18-19. That rate is measured on a time-weighted basis, and that measures the performance of the investment portfolio without considering the effects of cash flows such as contributions and benefit payments. On the following page, on TRB 158, we have a schedule of investments which provides details of the investment portfolio as of June 30 by investment type. And lastly, TRB 181 is the start of the required supplementary information, which are certain required pension and OPEB information, while the supplementary information schedules that start on TRB 187 present additional detailed information on investment and administrative expenses.
Okay, and then I just wanted to close with saying that there are no GASB standards that we're anticipating that will have a significant change to our financial statements in the coming year. However, we will be accounting for the bond transaction. We'll be selling those in December, so that's getting exciting to pay for our headquarters expansion project. So you will see some transactions in the next financial statements related to that. And then if we receive additional supplemental contributions from the state to pay down unfunded liabilities, then we will also account for that. So with that, we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Joy.
No questions. I think I just wanted to thank you very much for the brief presentation and This is the successful audit that we, reviewed and accepted yesterday. And I've had the opportunity as the chair of the ARM committee to have a conversation with the auditors from Crow, who have been, very complimentary. I think, Julie, of, you leading and working with them on your first audit since joining the organization, but also, being really complimentary and recognizing the stellar staff that we have in financial services. So Banky, that's you and all of your other colleagues. So thank you for everything that you're doing. It's great work.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Yeah,
again.
congratulations.
Great work.
Any other committee members? Seeing none. Thank you, Banky, for walking us through that, and thanks, Julie.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, I think you're staying up here, Julie, right? We're gonna go to Enterprise Risk Management Report. And that's Julie and Philip. And we've got 15 minutes allocated for this item.
Yes, thank you. So again, Madam Chair, members of the board, Julie Underwood, Chief Financial Officer, and I'm here with Phil Burkholder. He is our Enterprise Risk Manager, and we're presenting this semi-annual Enterprise Risk Management Report as of September 30, 2019. Now, this report provides oversight of CalSTR's management of its risks from an enterprise-wide perspective, and Phil will be walking you through the highlights of this report.
Great.
Good afternoon. Again, Phil Burkholder. So I just wanted to kind of share with you the report very briefly. I know I'm standing in the way between you and Mr. Stanton's presentation, and I want to hear it too. So, this report is the culmination of the work that we've been doing for the last 6 months to manage the enterprise risks for the organization. It's got two pieces to it. There's the heat map and the risk score report. The risk score report is a summarization of the risk ratings and the period over period change of 47 different sub-risks that we manage as an organization on a daily basis. So first I wanted to focus your attention on the heat map. And the next where I'd like to have the discussion is really around the heat maps. That's on TRB 202. So that's where we're going to have the discussion. This heat map is the new version that we shared with you in May. We took your comments and thoughts and we updated it somewhat, but it is basically what we showed you in May. What I'd like to start with is kind of talk about the two high risk items, risk categories that are represented here, and then we'll talk about some of the period over period changes that are represented here too. So working from left to right, you'll see pension administration is up from a residual perspective, which is the light gray bar for is sitting in the medium risk range. That particular risk category really represents our the risk associated with continuing to use START. Right, so that's what this one is about. We anticipate it'll stay there until we're able to fully implement pension solution. The next highest risk item there that sits, and it's actually up in our high range from a residual perspective, is information security. Again, that one is up there because of the environment we live in, that we have to work in on a daily basis with the persistent data breaches and persistent attacks on our systems. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I do want to point out that one of the reasons you see it portrayed that way is you have a three-dimensional risk with a two-dimensional tool. So what's not captured in there is velocity. So this is really the severity and the possibility, but velocity is not captured. Once you put velocity into the information security risk, that's what shoots it up off the charts. Phil has worked on this for years, and there's just no three-dimensional model. So I just want you to know that the risk is very severe, but the velocity of it adds to the risk profile.
Does velocity mean though, like the
How
frequency?
quickly it'll happen.
Right.
How quickly it can happen and cause damage?
And cause severe business disruption or worse.
Yeah. So Brian's right. This is still a two-dimensional depiction. The number that you have represented there does include velocity, but it's. I don't think it's we still haven't gotten there yet. We're still working on kind of finding the best way to portray velocity in this map.
That's fine. Dana?
Okay.
Okay,
Sorry,
I think
Phil,
one of
Dana.
the last conferences I went to when they were talking about velocity it's an unbelievably scary number when there's thousands of hits a second. And I think they were talking about a bank, and the bank was saying, yeah, we've got a couple thousand, and it might have even been a larger number, a second, every single day. That's crazy. I mean, that's nuts. And so you had, Philip, you had referred to the climate that we're in. So when we're talking about the risk, it's not necessarily the climate that we're in here at CalSTRS, it's the climate we're in within the world, correct?
So you've got the two columns here, and I'll certainly let Brian jump
Residual
in.
and inherent.
So the inherent is really is kind of just the world we're absolutely living in general. And then the second column, the lower of the two, represents the effectiveness of all of our mitigation activities.
Right.
So that's more the CalSTRS centric, our ability to.
But it's not, it's
I can try and answer.
how you talked about it on page 199 is that, I think that's the page that I found it on. Hang on just a second.
So I do not.
On 198, where it talks about, it's due to the current climate of data breaches and highly persistent hackers. When we're talking about that climate, we're talking about not just internal, but also external, correct? Not just that we're getting hit so much with hackers, but that the whole world's gone crazy with.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah,
Okay. I just want to make
You're
sure.
talking the third-party risk that we have associated with things, people we're doing
Right.
business with. Yeah, absolutely.
Super, thank you.
Go ahead, Bill.
Okay, so those are the those are the items that fall outside of the low risk after we've done all of our mitigation activities. So one of the enhancements we made to the risk, to the heat map since the last time we visited with you was we added some arrows. They're supposed to represent changes since the last time we've reported to you. So I'm just going to very briefly kind of walk you through the changes and a really high level what those are and what they represent. So starting from left to right with the pension funding investments. So we raised that risk rating to represent the challenges we're going to have from a resource perspective and attempting to support the collaborative model in addition to the pension solution and the new headquarters expansion. There's a finite number of resources, and so the quickness and of implementing the collaborative model may get affected because it's going to be competing with just that finite level of resources. So we just put that in there to make sure that we've actually accurately represented that.
It's like a trend line, right? Kind of like it's.
We just want to recognize that it really is. There's a risk there. We just don't know how, and we've done our best to rate it, but until we get further along, we're not going to really know. So moving over to financial reporting, we lowered the risk category there. That really represents all the good work that Banky and Art and the rest of Julie's financial reporting team has done to strengthen our internal controls. And that's represented by the audit and how clean the audits have been over the last few years. So we felt it's time to lower that risk. So we lowered that risk there. Working our way over to operational, this one's a little more complex. It's not as simple as just we lowered one risk rating. So the residual risk, so the light gray bar there, it lowered because we lowered a risk rating associated with our ability to manage our own risks. The organization has matured over the years. We've done a much better job of aligning our assurance functions. So during ARM, you'll hear Larry talk about kind of aligning both enterprise compliance, ERM, and internal audits, and kind of trying to streamline those operations. We felt we've made significant enough progress to lower the risk rating in that area. So that is what lowered the risk rating for the residual side. The inherent side changed, and we don't expect the inherent side to change a lot. In this case, it changed because we added a sub-risk, and because of the mathematics of how we determine the weighting and the scores, I call it the dilution factor, and that the sub-risk we added was a lower weighted and lower rated risk, and so it ended up lowering the inherent risk too for that rating. And then finally, the transformational change risk, that is really the result of us getting through the design phase and addressing the inconsistent business practices risk that we had identified. We felt we've done an adequate job there, and so we lowered the risk rating there. And that's what has driven that change. Those are,
So any questions on those changes? So I just wanted to recognize Phil and his team for recommending the changes in the heat map. I think the changes in the presentation have really allowed us to be able to see our risks from a more broader overall perspective. You know, for the one area where it went down, it really caused us to pause and say, well, does that really make sense? It's the math, but does it really make sense? And it's allowing us to have those more broader conversations in the organization. And so this is another great step in continuing to mature our risk program. So I just wanted to acknowledge the work that was done there.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
Thanks so much. I don't see any questions.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Julie. Thank you, Phil. I hope not everyone's getting sick or something. Everyone's like, okay, I'm gonna try and. It's kind of cool. Yeah. All right. So I think it's time for John Stanton. Flew from, I don't know what the weather's like in DC right now. It's cold.
I'm so excited.
Colder than Los Angeles, I'm guessing, so. So John, for new board members, it's a treat to have John come speak to us. He kind of gives us the perspective from DC, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So we always look forward to having you. We typically hear from John twice a year. It's always nice to have you live in the building.
Yep.
And so we have some time, 45 minutes set aside for you to give us your take on.
Well, happily I don't
things are
have to
at.
voice the words Elk Hills. We got our damn money, so. $325 million. I probably took 3 years off my life on that project.
Yes.
But it's great to be with you. Let's see if I got this thing working here.
I know, it's not crazy.
I wanted to cover a number of areas on a whole, kind of variety of subjects. Start out with sort of a quick overview of the congressional elections. They're a year out, which is an eternity in politics. But I thought it might be helpful to give you kind of a framework to understand sort of how things will be unfolding over the next year. I wanted to report on some encouraging developments on the WEP relief front in terms of at least bills being introduced that could help mitigate the situation. And then we've been working with Grant, Joycelyn, and the investment staff on a series of issues on sort of your investment, CalSTRS as an investor perspective, and we've been having regular calls, and I think it's been a very beneficial exercise. And so I know a number of you, Sharon and Jack, are involved in some of these climate ESG efforts. I wanted to kind of bring you up to date what's happening, at least on the House side, efforts to promote diversity in corporate boardrooms and management, then a series of sort of investor protection legislation, SEC, which has been sort of up to no good, which I'll explain a little bit more in a minute on a couple of fronts actually, and then legislation to promote retirement savings. But let me just kind of start out with a quick political overview, courtesy of Charlie Cook, who has a great way of sort of summarizing everything. Just to give you an idea, and this is the House of Representatives, and you may have been seeing in the press quite a number of Republicans are retiring, and I think it's a recognition that they're not going to be taking back the House anytime soon. Even though the House Democrats flipped a lot of seats, you'll see in order to get to the magic number for Republicans, 218 of a majority, they have to not only take all the toss-ups, they have to beat a number of the established Democrats. So it's a not particularly encouraging picture with a not particularly encouraging president. So I think they view themselves as being sort of in a tough spot. This just gets a lot of names for you, but basically the toss-ups in the middle are basically all the Dems that flipped Republican seats. And so they're, of course, most vulnerable because often in the following election, it kind of swings back the other way. It doesn't seem as though that's going to happen this year, but it just gives you an idea of how much turnover there's been since so many of these members are younger members. In our own delegation, I've worked here for 30 years, we've seen the Republicans sort of decimated. So in the last election, it was 46 Democrats. We're now down to 7 Republicans, pretty scrappy lot. Senior member is Congressman Ken Calvert from Corona. He's perhaps best known for being a charter member of the Oh Please Hall of Fame. This was after the police found him in the middle of the night by the side of the road in his car, half naked with a prostitute. Congressman Calvert explained that he was, quote, changing his clothes. So we sort of are learning to live with these alternative senses of reality in Washington as you push on. So there you go. This is our crowd. We got to work with them. In the Senate, in 18, Democrats had many more seats up than Republicans. That swung the other way. So 2020, the Republicans have 23 seats up for re-election, but it's sort of a commentary on the red states now. They're staying red, not a competitive race. So reality, the Democrats have to switch 4 seats to take control. I mean, in theory, if the Democrats win the presidency and the vice president could always cast the deciding vote, they only have to switch 3, but they have to flip basically 4 and keep all the ones they have. With Sessions' entry into the race, I don't know if they'll be able to keep Alabama, but they've got to beat, the toss-ups, Martha McSally, Arizona, Cory Gardner in Colorado, Collins in Maine, and reach into one of the Republican seats on the more established. So we'll have to see, but it gives you kind of a sense of the task that Democrats face in the Senate, where that could really, especially if a Democrat wins the White House, if the Democrats can flip the Senate, that gives their agenda a much more fulsome chance of moving forward. If they don't, then we could have some of the same sort of gridlock we've seen so far. I wanted to move on to some specific initiatives. I know the WEP relief legislation is always of great interest. Obviously, they're the sort of flat repeal bills, but they cost a fortune and have had trouble getting traction with lots of the members whose state employees are in Social Security. So Congressman Richie Neal, who's from Massachusetts, for Mayor of Springfield, who really knows about public employees, has a lot of non-covered employees in his district. And the ranking Republican former chairman, Kevin Brady, who has a lot of non-covered folks in Texas and Houston. Historically, they worked together on a single bill, and it was bipartisan, and there was a lot of momentum that they generated. And we're still not entirely clear on why they took separate paths, but they have this year. Neal has taken over as chairman, Brady has moved to ranking member. So on the Neal bill, HR 4540, I've tried to do a kind of a side-by-side comparison because these are the two vehicles that are out there. There's not a tremendous amount of difference, but there are differences. And I know, item number 1 of greatest interest to our folks is, what about current retirees? What happens? What kind of relief do we get? And they've decided to adopt this approach. Instead of having some formulaic thing, they're just going to write a check for $150 a month. Now, $150 a month is something, but whether it's enough to really, move the needle for our folks remains to be seen, I think. Brady would only give $100 a month. And for retirees going forward, they've tried, this is an idea that they've had before, which is basically move away from all these arbitrary formulas and WEP that seem to have no bearing on reality, and try to base the WEP on what the person's actual earning history was. What part of their earnings were covered, what part of their earnings weren't, and they have the WEP operate in that fashion. But still, the numbers are so large, and the number of people affected and the dollar amounts, they think even with this new kind of proportional approach, Congressman Neal had the Congressional Budget Office do some calculations. They think 7 out of 10 folks would get an average of $75 more. Again, it's better, but maybe not necessarily what folks would have hoped for. In terms of current exemptions, and I know this has been an issue that Cal Sturz was in the forefront of raising about what happens on the non-vesteds, because it was not clear under prior versions of the legislation. You get penalized for non-covered service, but you're not necessarily getting recognition of the fact you're getting no pension for that. And so Congressman Neal has taken that to heart, and so he's retaining the current exemption that basically says you're not getting any pension for that non-covered service. The WEP's not going to be triggered, because that's the whole sort of theory. You're getting this pension for non-covered service, and so you shouldn't be getting in their words, a double dip on Social Security. They've at least acknowledged that, so at least our non-vested problem sort of goes away. The legislation also try to avoid the surprise factor that continues to kind of happen with our folks. Oh my God, I didn't know that was going to affect me directly. And so they're trying to come up with ways on those periodic Social Security statements that, hey, this is coming. And then the last thing is they've had a number of vehicles for trying to enforce the WEP. One of the most controversial things that they did in the last round of bills, which they've dropped, which is they're going to go after grandma for to claw back Social Security that should have been covered by the WEP, but wasn't. Well, obviously, going after grandma for $10,000 is not very sympathetic, so they dropped that. Now, Neil takes a sort of a milder version. He says, well, if the worker has non-covered earnings, Social Security can reach out and say, are you getting a state and local pension? We'll study whether or not the plans can provide that information, but we're not going to go with what Brady and previously Neil had provided, which was they were going to march toward the day when CalSTRS would have to provide all kinds of reporting on non-covered folks in terms of, these people are getting a pension for a state and local pension for non-covered service, ergo the WEP ought to apply. So we would have been in the sort of awkward position of having kind of shining light on this group of folks. Neil takes he kind of keeps us out of the middle of that, which I think is helpful. I want to cover a couple of the sort of risk disclosure measures that you all have been interested in over time. Maxine Waters has been the Energizer bunny. She didn't quite have the low IQ that President Trump accused her of having, and we've worked with her before in CalSTRS with all the efforts of our efforts over the years and the investment staff and Grant and everyone. We've developed a very good relationship with her. So they reach out and ask CalSTRS' view on a lot of these initiatives, which gives us kind of a chance to weigh in while the thing is still being formulated, as opposed to here it is, yes or no, or you're trying to undo a decision that's already been made. And so they have reported out a climate risk disclosure bill to the full House, and it would require public companies in their annual reports to disclose financial and business risks associated with climate change. Now, it would require the SEC to develop these metrics, climate-related metrics, and they're supposed to be industry-specific, supposed to be quantitative, qualitative. But they punt to the SEC the task of saying, well, what are the guts of this legislation? And, from a legislative drafting perspective, you can't think of everything. You do a list of things. Oh my God, I forgot to put that on the list, but it's frozen in time in the statute. So ordinarily, you'd say, all right, let's just leave that to the regulators. Well, query with the current Republican SEC majority, would they have their heart in this exercise? And I think that sort of is an open question. But a number of developments have occurred that I think are very positive for sort of the long-run view on climate risk disclosure. And that is, you have these two new industry coalitions that have developed within this year, 19, the CEO Climate Dialogue, and if you'll note in there, in addition to other Fortune 100 companies, there are a number of energy companies, BP, Shell, and they are taking the tack of urging, okay, let's have the market figure this out. We'll just have carbon pricing that's applied economy-wide, and we have this goal of achieving 80% reduction by 2050. The Climate Leadership Council, some of the same companies, they overtly support a carbon tax paired with a rebate to the customer to sort of help alleviate the impact of the carbon tax. They've hired Frank Luntz, who's a respected Republican pollster, and he's then polling in the GOP to try to show some of their members on the Hill that are still in the climate denial stage that, hey, a big percentage of GOP voters are concerned that the party's stance on climate is hurting them, and that 3 out of 4 Americans, including 55% of the Republicans, want the government to step in. So, in the week when our president has begun the withdrawal from the Paris Accord, it seems as though they're fighting that trend. And, I think these business group efforts, particularly the leadership of the energy companies, it's an initial turning of the tide on the climate change debate on the Hill. In my view, climate change, it remains a long game, but I think the business energy coalition involvement is an important step toward building a consensus, because it's really underscoring the sort of quantitative risks. I mean, the debate, I think, has importantly moved beyond being attacked by, these are the little old ladies in the tennis shoes and the tree huggers and the nuns, to sort of saying, okay, what's the impact? And it turns out the Federal Reserve, the San Francisco Fed, a lot of the regional banks do a lot of economic research, kind of beneath the radar screen of, getting Trump's from tweet about lowering the interest rate. And they're having a conference, as would happen today, on global warming's effect on economic growth, interest rates, labor markets, and monetary policy. And then the G20 banks, everybody but us, because I think the chairman of the Fed doesn't want to get another tweet from Trump, they formed this kind of clearinghouse for information for the central banks to exchange information on the economic effects. So I think the more and more it becomes a quantitative exercise in pricing risk, and the more that analysts start asking about it in their earnings calls, because Reuters had an article earlier in the week that said there were, I guess over the course of this past year, 70 companies have addressed climate change in their earnings calls, which is like a multiple of anything that's ever happened. And as we know, once the analysts start asking about it, then the companies start focusing on it. So I think there's some real positive developments there. Sure.
Okay, thank you. I think this is really exciting to see so much movement kind of coming in areas we haven't seen before. And I'm just curious, so now with the energy companies and other companies supporting a carbon price at the federal level, do you see them using that as a tactic to say we'll support the carbon pricing, but we don't want to do corporate disclosure? Or are they asking for something else?
No, I think it's sincere in that respect. I mean, they may be a little bit more hesitant about, ExxonMobil's being, hauled up before by the New York Attorney General. I think they've taken a long-term view, and they want an economic-wide solution. So in a sense, it kind of removes them from kind of the crosshairs. I mean, disclosure, if you've got a solution in place, then maybe disclosure, some of the pressure is taken off that, because disclosure is kind of being used as a tool to figure out, how much of an impact is they're really having. So, I sort of, on that part of the exercise, seeking these broader proposals, I sort of take them at their word for now that that's a sincere effort. We'll see whether they continue to sort of resist disclosure, risk disclosure. I mean, one of the complications for the oil and gas companies, especially for some of the second tier ones, you start disclosing all this stuff, and it can affect your ability to raise capital to keep doing your fracking, things like that. So there is a bit of a tension there, I agree. But I think, part of this is just getting the momentum built where people are going to have to address this issue on the Hill. Because right now you got a bunch of them have their heads in the sand. You look at the Electoral College, it's all these Western state conservative Republicans who have, coal deposits, and they're sort of, they are hesitant to cross the Rubicon. But I think each step of a quantitative impact, I think, becomes harder to deny, along with these, more severe weather events. I mean, just underscore it. So, the seed companies, I was reading an article about the seed companies, they're saying, well, what's their disclosure about how they would be affected by this flooding, and in turn the farmers' willingness to buy. So, I mean, I think the more that gets out there.
John, who are the most credible voices? Just if you were in charge of a advocacy campaign here, and who are the most credible voices to move Congress now? Would it be banks?
I think it's these.
Would it be Federal Reserve?
It's a combination of factors. I mean, I think when you have business groups, including major energy companies, going around accepting either carbon pricing or even a carbon tax, so it's kind of, well, who are you, you say to a Republican, who are you defending? I mean, here are the guys that are affected, and they're in there saying we ought to do this. It makes it harder to respond. So the powerful thing about it is that it shifts focus away from, the institutional investors are seen as doing the bidding of the unions and the nuns and the tree huggers and the little old ladies in tennis shoes. These are executives, business executives are saying, look, this is a business risk for me.
Right.
And it's not some sort of politically charged, feel-good environmental agenda. And I think it can only help to take such a quantitative focus. So I think, and these folks are active. I mean, they're having meetings on the Hill. They've hired this, expensive polling. They're really trying to sort of take a sophisticated approach by saying to Republicans who are resistant, hey, look at your own crowd. They're people, especially the millennials, the younger folks that the Republicans are concerned about, particularly the suburban Republicans. they want you to do something. Time is running on. And so I think having this debate continue on and then having, Fed-like data about, well, here are the macro impacts, I think that's the most effective way to do it. And in fact, we can continue to follow the disclosure tack, but I think this crowd pushing, kind of the ultimate solution is really the most effective.
How do you think Congress perceives California's emission standards around this issue with the automobile companies? Do you think that they view this as, a West Coast issue, or do you think they see this as a important national issue?
They haven't connected the two yet. I mean, first thing I learned in representing CalSTRS 30 years ago was that members of Congress will get up a half an hour early if they can stick it to California. So we start from that premise, but it's this whole thing with the way that has unfolded. Trump is saying, you ought to be sweeping the forests, but I'm going to let, I'm going to let tailgate emission or tailpipe emissions continue. And then he says, I'll bring an antitrust suit against the companies that agreed to go by the California standard. I think that California, there's sort of a disconnection, I guess I would say, that they don't, I think the smart members understand that California kind of leads the way, and by setting its own state standard on that score, it kind of brings the others along because it forces the manufacturers to meet that standard. But I think this whole thing with the wildfires and it's just, that's something that's happening to them, is sort of the way it's looked at, I think, on the Hill, unfortunately. I mean,
Do you think that the San Francisco Fed will be able to maintain their independence and continue with their agenda that they're doing now?
I think it's at the regional bank level, and the regional banks are kind of run, they're sort of owned by, the Fed's got this kind of hybrid structure, and they've got much more sort of local control. They have locally appointed boards. They sort of, the local banks are the members, and so I think that that will continue on. It's hard to sort of say, if this were being done at the national level, I think your point would be more concerning because, we start seeing this spew of tweets aimed at the chairman. But this is happening kind of down in the bowels. And, they've got tremendous resources of high credibility. And I think if they come out with, quantitative analyses that show the impact, I think it's going to have a significant effect. I mean, it just becomes harder and harder to sort of deny science when you're saying, okay, well, however it's developing, this is what the impact is going to be. So I think it's going to be a confluence of factors where it's going to take a while to sort of reach a critical mass, but having as many sort of independent kind of fact gatherers and analysis, the better. So I guess it's all encouraging. I mean, again, it's going to take a little while. We have a Democratic president, a Democratic Senate, it could spur along a little faster. But
John, I've got one more board member. Keith,
Okay.
do you want to jump in?
Yeah, it's typical when an industry is under attack to not co-opt, but use a process to get something that is more to their liking than what
Yes.
they're afraid of. So in one sense, market-based approach, economy-wide carbon pricing or carbon tax is better than what we have overall. On the other hand, there's no real market to buy carbon. How do you really price carbon? Because it is an externality that's destroying if you're in the climate change, I mean, how do you price that?
I guess, they couple it with this 80% reduction by 2050, which is, 30 years from now. And so I think they're trying to use that as a hammer to say, well, it's going to be a price that's going to have a bite. So I guess I understand what you're talking about, because a lot of times they try to,
What are they trying to avoid is really what the,
I think
what is the worst?
I think they've made a conscious decision. They want to have a seat at the table, because I think they have a long run recognition that if they sit by and be the science deniers, then ultimately, it may not be in the next 5 years, it may not be in the next 10 years, but probably in the next 20 years, they're going to have a solution that's going to be handed to them and say, all right, this is the way it is. And so I think those with greater foresight are saying, well, let's get involved in the shaping of this thing, because they want it to be shaped somewhat to their liking. But, I don't think, having been a lobbyist for 40 years, and I know exactly what you're talking about, which is you take the other guy's proposal, you keep the name the same, and then you make it your proposal. And I don't think that's what's happening here. I think this is a sincere effort. People may fall off the wagon at various points, depending on what tax rate the other crowd wants to do. But for now, at least, it's moved debate to a much more serious level, I think, then that has a real sort of impact of its own, I think. Just kind of keep rolling along here. I appreciate the questions. ESG disclosure. Well, this is an area where, again, the Financial Services Committee taking a leadership role, and Congressman Juan Vargas from Chula Vista and El Centro is taking on this. And it takes a similar approach to the climate bill, which is companies have to disclose ESG metrics. They got to say, well, how have they figured out what's important between ESG metrics and long-term business performance? How are they going to measure it? The bill would say these are deemed material, so they have to disclose them. The problem is, once again, that the SEC is left with the task of deciding it. And if we were sort of wary of the SEC in climate risk, we're even warier here, because the current SEC majority, they view this whole area as sort of suspect because it's fuzzy wuzzies, it's human rights disclosure. How's that human rights? What should that matter about the company? And this is an area, and I'll talk about this in a little bit when we talk about what the SEC has done. The current majority and, comments at meetings, speeches, they've implied that this whole ESG area is one where the proxy advisors, their money manager clients, and the institutional investors, as I put it, are acting in this unholy trinity to pursue politically charged agendas really at the expense of mom and pop investors. So the suggestion is any consideration of ESG factors is somehow at the odds of the interests of mom and pop and the long-term performance of the company. And then in the background for all this, the Senate Banking Committee, from which Commissioner Roisman, who's been leading the charge on proxy, they've been having a whole series of hearings to kind of, bang this drum about, gosh, this whole ESG thing, it's just these guys that are disconnected from reality. They don't have to answer their clients. They're not considering their clients. They're just, kind of holding hands and doing this stuff. And, the proxy advisors are recommending they do it. They ask asset managers, they don't have time to focus on it, but they just sort of blindly go along. I mean, it's sort of a narrative. It's a little hard to understand, but that's the narrative that exists. So the bill's been passed. It's been sent over to the Senate. We'll see. The Senate Banking Committee, unfortunately, is chaired by Mike Crapo from Idaho, who's a very conservative member. But, you got to start somewhere. You got to put the stuff out there. You got to put out the idea. And, there's progress being made. I wanted to bring to your attention sort of an insidious development. The White House, he loves to issue these executive orders, and he issued this executive order back in April saying, how can we encourage energy development in the country? Well, buried in about paragraph 15 was, okay, here's what we're going to do to try to kind of stem the tide of this ESG factors. He tells the Labor Department, they've got to review their existing planned fiduciary guidance to see whether proxy voting on ESG factors should be changed or dropped to ensure that the current guidance as revised is consistent with long-term growth and maximizing return at ERISA plan assets. So they're trying to suggest that the plan, it doesn't affect us, ERISA, we're not subject to ERISA, but it's not helpful to have, private plans be told, no, it violates your fiduciary duty to consider ESG factors because it's not consistent with long-term growth. Well, they haven't quite, they've been told this is a path they ought to go down. 6 months later, they haven't gone down it completely yet, but it's just out there and it could pop out one day. And it's something we just need to be aware of, because I think it would cause, an earthquake in the private plan community, but we'll see. On a related administration front, you'll recall the name Joshua Rao, who was sort of our nemesis for many years on PEPTA, which would require us to report our liabilities based on a risk-free rate of return. I mean, it's kind of interesting to watch him. I mean, he's used this one-trick pony act. He started out as a business professor at Northwestern, then he went to University of Chicago, and he leveraged it at Stanford, the Hoover Institute. Scarily, he has now been appointed the chief economist for the President's Council on Economic Advisors. So I don't know, it's like there's no other economist in the country who's a conservative Republican, but bears watching, because, he continues to sort of beat this drum, in the wake of I was listening to hear David talking about the crash. In the wake of the 2008 crash, he listed all these public plans are going to run out of money by 2020. Well, of course, none of them have. No one seems to look back on that research and say, what the hell were you thinking? Doesn't seem to have diminished his ability to, get prestigious jobs. But anyway, he's out there, got to keep an eye on him. I know corporate diversity has been another area that y'all have had interest in over the years. There's been a significant effort in the House Financial Services Committee to support disclosure. I think disclosure of the gender, race, and ethnicity of the board. One of the bills would add senior executives. The interesting thing is the Republicans decide, I think, that, well, look, we can't just be sitting around as seeing as a bunch of old white guys sitting around. We better do something at least to reach out to women voters. So they decided to embrace this issue. And so it's sort of, at the markup was this kind of out-of-body experience, listening to these GOP members go on, one after the other. What's the right thing to do? Diversity leads to better decision-making, risk management for what's long-term economic performance. I mean, those words ought to be written down, filed away, because it's sort of shocking, but hey, they're going to vote for it, we'll take it. So broad bipartisan vote on these bills, these disclosure bills. I think there's a good chance they will be taken up swiftly in the House and passed, given their bipartisan support. How they happen in the Senate, who knows? But again, it's putting a marker down about what ought to be the right approach to try to encourage diversity in the ranks. There's a companion bill applying to asset managers that our investment staff had some concerns about. That how are we going to get involved in this effort of defining who's diverse and the whole exercise. We live under all these procurement restrictions. Blah. So they took an approach. It's still in the discussion draft phase, and the Financial Services Committee puts the onus on the issuers and the investment advisors. So it kind of takes us out of the gun sights. And it's sort of, for those of you that follow sports, I don't know how many you do. This is kind of known as the Rooney Rule in the NFL, which is trying to develop black candidates for head coaching jobs. And so they have, the rule is, circulate RFPs to sort of draw out interest. And then if a minority or women-owned candidate applies, you got to consider them. And if one submits a proposal, you got to interview them. And then there has to be this annual reporting. Well, what percentage of your services are provided by minority and women-owned? What percentage of your asset management contracts? So that, for whatever reason, is not, it hasn't yet gotten traction in terms of having the committee mark it up, but the committee's, Maxine Waters is having these markups about every month, so it's possible it could still come back. So I would still move forward. And then she's, been promoting a whole series of investor protection securities law enforcement. I mean, this is like being back in the days of Dodd-Frank, when you had Democratic chairmen who actually cared about investor protection. And so things are happening after years of sort of inaction. And the interest we have is sort of from the defrauded investor perspective. I mean, investing sort of in the marketplace widely, as you're forced to do because of your size, then, you can be subject to, fraud on the market. And it's interesting that the Supreme Court just accepted a case in which the SEC's authority to require disgorgement to provide restitution for investors, defraud investors, has been challenged. So it's not an inconsequential number. It's about $800 million a year that they've provided. The House was kind of dealing with a different problem, which is, when you have a securities fraud, it's complicated. First of all, you got to figure out what happened, then you got to figure out what happened, then you've got to figure out who did it. And by then, the current statute of 5 years is almost expired, so they've extended that. And then Congresswoman Katie Porter from down in Irvine, former law professor, she's really a breath of fresh air at these hearings. I don't know if you've seen any clips of her, but she's a real dynamo, and she just nails these CEOs. They don't see it coming, and boom. If they've said something else, that somewhere in some other venue, she's got the contradiction. But anyway, she's got a couple of good ideas, which is increase the SEC's penalty authority and link it to the size of the harm. And then she's got the last one, which is, every time they impose this huge fine on the company, then, guess who bears the burden of that? Well, it's the investors. She's saying, well, all right, public companies, you got to have a policy on whether or not, it's the shareholders or the executives that bear the cost. So, I think it's all to the good. And then there's the last issue, which had been of interest to the CalSTRS investment staff, and this is the so-called gap between when something significant happens to the company and when they have to report it. And, executives have been known to trade in that interim window. This would prevent that from happening. So they've moved out, these bills have all moved to the full House from the Financial Services Committee, and it's been, as I say, kind of a refreshing change from the events of the past. Now, let me just kind of bring up to date on the SEC here, because I talked about the unholy trinity between proxy advisors, investment managers, and institutional investors. Well, the SEC has decided, they're not going to sort of fully confront the issue of proxy voting by institutional investors on these resolutions. They're going to chip away at it from a number of directions, I think, by focusing on proxy advisory firms and investment advisors. So they've imposed new requirements on the investment advisors, saying, well, you got to show it's in the best interest of your clients. Well, the bigger, more sophisticated managers, can do that, but the smaller investment advisors who are voting mom and pop shares, they may be harder pressed to say, well, mom and pop investor in Nebraska voting on this ESG resolution, how does that help? How can I establish that? And they also require the investment advisor has to make a reasonable investigation of matters being voted on. Well, again, they're suggesting maybe you can't just rely on the proxy advisor's recommendation. And so that leads to the next sort of little tricky development, which is saying, well, you're not obligated to vote every proxy. So all of a sudden, they've chilled the interest on voting proxies by investment managers on a lot of subjects, potentially, because they don't want to have to get into this whole exercise, costly exercise. And if they don't have to vote the proxy, then, because mom and pop, how do we show their interests are being protected? Then they don't vote, and that's a block of support that otherwise would have supported a progressive resolution. And then they have to exercise oversight over the proxy advisory firm. Well, proxy advisory firms sort of took it in the shorts this week, and it's a long sets of guidance. The investment staff is on the case. They've already worked to put out a statement giving a reaction, negative reaction to this, and there's a 60-day comment period. They're delving into it, but let me just give you a couple of highlights. So the SEC has decided the proxy advisory firm needs to be subject to the securities fraud laws. They've sort of concocted this theory that they're actually soliciting a proxy because they're advising you how to vote your proxy. They must be soliciting. So therefore, they become subject to the securities fraud laws, which means any mistake of significance in their factual mistake, disagreement over methodology, they haven't disclosed all their sources of information, suddenly, and this isn't a report to their client, it's not, not something that is sort of in the marketplace generally, that could be the subject of a securities fraud action. And then secondly, and I think this is even more controversial, the corporate community has been, arguing for years, all this stuff happens behind the curtain, we have no role in this, they make all these mistakes, they tell all these lies about us, they have this methodology that's not fair, it's a generic methodology on executive comp, it doesn't capture the fact, we're just special wizards in our senior management, we should be governed by some other standard. Well, they came up, so the business community has been pressing to have a review of the draft reports before it goes to you. And they came away under the SEC guidance with not one, but 2 bites at the apple. So initially, the issuer gets 3 to 5 days, depending on when they filed their material for the annual meeting. The issuer gets 3 to 5 days to complain about the draft report. And so they send in all their objections. The proxy advisor firm does whatever it's going to do. It's not obligated to take their objections, but it's supposed to consider it. Then, before it even goes to you again, they have to give it back to the issuer and give them 2 days to say, well, did you change it or not? And if you didn't change it, or I didn't think you changed it the way you should have, then they're required to include a hyperlink in the proxy advisor report to you, a hyperlink to the statement of management saying, well, here are all the things that are wrong with it. So it's going to put a lot more burden, obviously, on the proxy advisory firms. I think it's going to be, they're kind of the big 2 now, but this is certainly going to chill smaller guys from getting in the business. And it's going to, they're going to have to get the cost from somewhere, which is you, the client, most likely, for all this extra time, all these extra stages. And, given the kind of the bang play of when, management files its stuff for the meeting and when the proxy advisor has to look at it, and they have to get the stuff to you so you can decide how to vote your proxy. How all this is going to happen, in the time that they have without some extraordinary effort that, extraordinary costs. So this is, in my view, I mean, I'm speculating here, but this is how the SEC is sort of cutting back on, they've got this majority, and the chairman is, he has this disarming quality. He's a nice guy. He has sort of a inclusive way of sort of handling matters in terms of the meetings. But I think this is the way they've kind of pursued their agenda to sort of disconnect this unholy trinity between the advisor, the investment managers, and the institutional investors, because they're not attacking the institutional investors directly. I think they realize that could be a political minefield, but they've sort of chilled the interest of the investment advisors in being aggressive in voting proxies. They've saddled the proxy advisory firms with all these new restrictions. They're going to add cost to it. So we'll see. These are proposed amendments on the proxy advisor firm. I think ISS has already sued them, and there's a 60-day comment period. So we'll have to see how that shakes out. But it's, I think the investment staff, Chris and staff can speak for themselves, but I think there's a lot of concern about it. The other thing that they did in the new guidance was to they raised the submission, the ownership thresholds for submitting a resolution. Obviously, given our size, it's not really a problem. They raised it, $10,000, that kind of thing. But on the resubmission thresholds, and that's a situation where, sometimes it takes several years and several go-rounds to build up a critical mass of, support among the shareholders to do something. They've under the guise, you just had all these zombie proposals out there that, oh my God, why do we have to consider that for the 10th time? That was kind of the justification. But the thresholds they use, how many times has it come up? What level of vote did it get? They've really tightened that up. And so the theory is it's really going to cut. Commissioner Jackson said that would just immediately sort of disenfranchise 40% of the proxy access resolutions, which are, put your own nominees on the board up for election. 40% of those would have just been disqualified by that. So there are ways in which, under the guise of tightening, modernizing, clarifying, they're really cutting back. So we'll have to see. Again, those are up for comment, 60-day comment. We'll have to see how much of a furor develops on that front.
I think Lynn has a question about that. So.
This is such a disturbing development with the SEC, and we've seen it coming for a while, and the controller's been really watching this, upset about it, and glad to see, and CalSTRS has always been at the forefront of commenting to the SEC and putting out strong letters and comments. But I'm just curious, what do you think is the likelihood of this passing absent any change in leadership at the SEC, the administration? And what more can investors like CalSTRS be doing to fight this?
Well, I think that one of the things, one of the strong tools that we have available is we and public plans generally is the relationship with Maxine Waters and the House Financial Services Committee, because she has used sort of the hearing venue as an opportunity to really bang the drum against various actions that the SEC has taken. She had all 5 of the commissioners up for an oversight hearing, which she took them to task already for some of the things they've done. I think that's a way to sort of build public pressure. I think this is a very well thought out strategy they're pursuing. Reuters had an article earlier this week, some of you may have seen, talking about how that the SEC chairman sort of developed this kind of death of 1,000 cuts, where they've done 20 things that are going to kind of curtail activity. And the guys always says, we have a fraction of the public companies we used to. It's because of all this stuff, So we're getting rid of all this stuff, or we're tightening it up. And I think this is a concerted strategy in the absence of really tremendous public pressure. I think it's going to go through. The proxy advisory firm, I lived through the days of Dodd-Frank with you in the crash. They've made the same argument that they did with the credit rating. It's these 2 monopolists, and they control the whole thing, and they're just running roughshod. And, that's the public narrative, and the reality is the mom and pop retail investor, this is so far disconnected from them. So I think absent some tremendous furor, I think it's going to go through. We'll just have to see. I mean, ISS has sued them. Do they have the authority to do this? I mean, they could be tied up in the case, courts for years. But if you kind of scare away the investment advisors from voting proxies, it's hard to kind of undo that. So.
Who are the large asset managers in this?
Well, I mean, I kind of defer to Chris in terms of the largest of the investor, asset managers, but it's not so much just the large ones that this is really, I'll let him hear straight from the source. What I was gonna say is that especially these, the investment advisors, I think what it really chills is kind of the mid-level, the medium-sized ones. Because the big ones, they have, processes and procedures because of their scale that they can implement or, develop a policy that will implement this. It's kind of the mid-level guys who represent mom and pop are gonna say, oh my God, I'm barely, keep my head above water with these fees and all these things, zero, open up this account for zero, and I think that's gonna be the impact. But Chris, you may have.
I just think, just before Chris answers, I just was curious to see if the Vanguard, BlackRock, if they are joining the fight against this, or they're just kind of sitting back because, as you say, it doesn't really impact their operations.
Chris Hellman, your Chief Investment Officer. If Aisha is watching upstairs, she will probably text me the answer to that. I don't believe, we wanted to be out there quick. If you didn't see it, was in Pension and Investments daily report today. I think we're about the third article that CalSTRS has already come out strongly opposed to this. And we wanted to be clear and loud fast. And I would agree with John's comments. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street all have their own staffs now, just like we do. And for your sake, so you understand, we look and subscribe to these services, but we do not follow their views at all. We make our own opinion. You have proxy guidelines that you've given us. We vote them in line. We look at that just as a litmus test of where did they come out. And there's times I've told you, I can tell you, we've disagreed. But to his point, it is the mid-sized firms. I've been at two other plans that were much smaller. We didn't have the time and the staff, so we followed the proxy advisors' guidelines. I know at least in one state, it's in their contract, their managers vote their proxies, and they require them to then follow those guidelines so that the managers, except in a few cases, are not allowed a lot of discretion. So it is the small-sized ones. I can tell you, sadly, most of them probably didn't even pay attention to this ruling. We're going to have to wake them up. But the industry organizations that are involved in this are alarmed, and even red states, I'll pick on my good friends of Florida, are outraged at this. So I think that groundswell is what we need in the next 60 days to get their attention and hopefully push this to a longer discussion.
It's good to know. Thank you.
All right, go ahead, Jack.
John, I wanted to just push a little bit on your theory about Congress and their involvement from Maxine on this, and just this tension between Congress and a regulatory body. I mean, let's say the shoe was on the other foot and the SEC did something we like, that's supportive of protect. I know it's been a long time, but imagine that. Imagine that moment.
The good old days.
And then congressional committee says, well, that's crazy, that fiduciary rule. They shouldn't be doing that. They don't have the power to do it. They shouldn't be doing it. We're going to pass a bill to over it. And wouldn't our position be that that's not their role in Congress? This is a duly appointed regulatory body with those powers? Or do you think that's a good tension, that if you don't like the SEC, you run to Congress and try to overrule their decisions? Is that the model we should be having for governance here?
It's a bully pulpit.
It is, but is it a good governance model to use Congress as that safety valve if you just suddenly don't like something there?
Well, I mean, as a lobbyist, you use the tools that are available. And if that's a tool that's available, I would suggest we use it. I mean, I think SEC, I mean, the Congress passed these laws, and the Securities and Exchange Act, which is the authority under which a lot of this is occurring, that's a statute they passed, and how it's actually being administered and the impact that it has. Because the SEC has sort of broad, guidance to, encourage capital formation, orderly markets, that sort of thing. That's kind of their overarching mission statement. But the details of how the law is being applied, I think, could anyone ever conjure up that a proxy advisor was soliciting a proxy because they were sending you a report about how you might want to vote yours? And so I think, interpretations of the statute, which is sort of what's going on here, I think those are legal questions. I think when it's a regulatory action, an enforcement action that's applying the known law to the particular facts, I agree that's not something to be interfered with. But I think how the statutes are being interpreted and whether these stances are consistent with the policies on which those statutes are predicated, I think is is one that gives Congress a role.
I just think it's hard for a regulator to do their job well if they think every time you make a decision, someone doesn't like your decision, they're gonna hire a good lobbyist and try and take you out
Well, it
Congress.
could be, I mean.
And that's
you
just,
know,
it's a
part of it is
model of
providing a-
governance, it's not
Part
good.
of it is providing a counterweight, though, to what's been happening in the Senate Banking Committee, which is where Commissioner Roisman, who's sort of spearheading this effort, he came from. They had a whole series of hearings for no apparent legislative purpose, other than to make the case that it's the unholy trinity pursuing these ESG resolutions that have no tie to mom and pop. And so they were kind of building up a record on that score, and I view this as sort of a counterweight. I mean, I don't think, you know.
Can I call on my
You
expert?
can, you can. She
Father,
hears,
sit
she
down
hears
here, Aisha.
SEC and she comes, it's like Pavlovian, right? Come on in, Aisha. Give us
Hi.
your perspective on
Let
this
the boss
conversation.
give you that true answer here.
Okay, what was the question? I was in the elevator. What was the question?
Well, Jack was asking whether, I had suggested the House Financial Services Committee could provide a bully pulpit to go to if we were unhappy with how this was turning out on proxy advisory firms or the proxy voting by investment advisors. And he was saying, well, if, you know, should we sort of apply a more consistent approach where, you know, we just tell Congress to stay out of it, if we like it or if we don't like it? And he was just sort of, I said it was kind of a legal
I wasn't asked about
interpretation.
this issue, Ashish. I would say, is it a good model of governance if the regulator is always looking over their shoulder for someone that didn't like what they did and they run to Congress and hire a lobbyist every time? And how do we actually have good public policy made with this model? Because we're using it the same way. We don't like this decision, so we're going to our friends in Congress.
Sure.
And, but let's talk about the practical issue. I'll move away from public policy here.
Question Lynn asked was, are BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street
Yeah.
going to get involved in?
Dana, why don't you ask?
I don't know. I can't speak for them.
We're on tape, so let's not
Sorry, I'm
represent.
gonna have Dana ask Jack a question and then get back to Aisha.
So Jack, I think you bring up an intriguing idea. I think,
As a former regulator, I've had this.
I was just gonna say, you do have some experience.
so
I'm guessing it's-
how else, my question, I guess, would be, how else do you deal with a regulatory agency that is appointed by the government?
Well, the best model is to depoliticize the regulatory agency as best as you can. I mean, that's the problem.
Right.
We now unfortunately view the SEC, well, they're now under the control of this
Right.
administration, or if it was a friendly administration, they're that. Just like you often think about the Supreme Court nowadays. And that is the problem. There are regulators out there, I mean, there's an amazing number of federal regulators, and not all of them have that, at least, John, you correct me, I don't think they all have a political label necessarily associated with them. But this one has gotten to be, and so now we view Congress as not just us, but our enemies view it as the way to counteract decisions they don't like. Sorry, I don't want to take this in a whole big theoretical
Just remind me
moment
again
here.
how commissioners are appointed to the SEC.
By the president.
They're all by the
Yeah, and
president.
they have to have, I think, at least 2 and 2 from each
That's
party,
right.
and then he appoints the chairman.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So you have
That
to,
they
you
have
have 2
terms, but
Democratic
that
seats,
it's
you have
all
2
appointed by a
Republican
president.
seats.
But as a
And the term-
vacancy occurs, it has to be from that party that John just
they
mentioned.
pick somebody in
So
the Senate.
potentially, a
But there are two,
Republican
too.
president has to pick a Democrat
Yeah, and that happened with
commissioner.
Commissioner Lee, Allison Heron Lee, she's
Thank you.
a SEC staffer, and Schumer put her name forward.
But anyway,
But he
So
picks
Aisha,
the
do you wanna,
chairman.
did you guys?
That's a longer debate, right?
I'm mindful of the time, we only have a few
Yeah.
more minutes left for John's presentation. Did you have more to add, Aisha, from your
No,
question?
unless you had a specific question for me, but
I think.
I think what's up here right now, what we're really concerned about was the November 5th, the proposed rule.
right.
Yeah,
you
this
know.
was written before that.
Exactly. So, I mean,
And
we're,
I took them through that, kind of
Okay,
this
good.
2-step process,
Yeah.
and,
Let's do the best interest one. I want to make sure that you have time to tell them
Oh,
what
okay,
happened, because
well, let me-
everyone wants to know about the
all right,
fiduciary.
should
and I
go
can
around,
just
Aisha.
leave off the last thing on retirement savings. Yeah, this happened a while back, but it's been since the last time I saw you. And that is the best interest standard for retail investors. You recall that Obama's Labor Department had enacted a pretty tough fiduciary duty rule that for, in the case of retirement advice to retail investors, the advisor had to act in fiduciary duty to act in the best interest Well, the Obama rule was overturned by the courts. It's beyond the Labor Department's authority. So the SEC, which had kind of concurrent jurisdiction, stepped in and earlier this year adopted an approach that I think many consumer advocates have regarded as sort of toothless. They call it best interest, so initially it sounds like the same for brokers dealing with retail investors, but there's no fiduciary duty to act in their best interest. They don't even define what best interest is. So they tout, hey, best interest, but you don't even know what it is. No requirement to provide, best available options to the client. And then they sort of allow the broker to meet the best interest standard by doing these three things, which are really sort of a process-based safe harbor, which basically the broker has to provide some reasonable disclosure about its relationship with the retail customer. Well, another 10 pages of stuff that nobody can read. They have to exercise reasonable care to understand the product and have a reasonable basis to believe it's in the consumer's best interest. Well, the current standard is it has to be suitable. So this doesn't sound like it's revolutionarily more tough than a suitability standard. And then they have to disclose conflicts. So Attorney General Becerra joined in the group, the whole group of state AGs who are suing to overturn these rules as not protecting retail investors. So that's going to wend its way through the courts. But for now, maybe there's, a few things have changed, but I think what people are really aiming for is protecting individual retail investors with their retirement advice and trying to distinguish between a broker who's selling a product and an investment advisor who's supposed to be invited. I think they have done little to really provide tough new standards to protect retail investors on retirement security. So it's,
Well, John, I think the other thing is it's just been flip-flopping. I mean, the DOL has had different mixed messages, and now with the SEC, I just think for people following this, it just feels like the lack of consistency of message, and I think on the DOL piece on fiduciary duty, and then having that change, and I think for regular people, it's confusing. What's
And I think this is an example of what you'd asked about earlier, where I think they sort of hijacked the concept of best interest, but then left it sort of toothless because they never even defined what it is. So how can that be the standard if you don't know what it is? And then they said, if you just give them all these piles of paper and you have some reasonable basis to say, yeah, it should have been okay,
right,
then that's best interest. So, I think that's kind of what's happened here. It's been sort of disappointing.
But I just want to flag this, John, because, it goes back to Elise's data she presented to you earlier on benefits and services. I mean, we have a large portion of our membership that has some relationship to a financial advisor. To John's point, they don't know that it's a FINRA-regulated broker-dealer or an SEC-regulated IA or RA. It's very, very confusing. And now with this change, I doubt they understand how that affects the sale of the product to them in that transaction.
Yeah, and
I don't know if we should think about doing some just education for our members in our publications about this, even though it's not about our products, but clearly our members are.
Are you a fiduciary? I think that's the key question that people need to be asking.
Well, I will say the SEC has adopted this sort of teacher education program, and you could make that, part of it, they could come and explain themselves about, well, how's this really, this is how it's supposed to protect you. Well, maybe they can explain it better than they have so far.
Yep.
Anything?
Nothing you
John?
can't read in the rest of the report, so
Okay.
it's been a long day, I know.
We always it's actually very helpful to kind of get we always appreciate getting the big picture.
Covered a lot of ground anyway. The investment staff and government affairs, we've had these regular calls, so it's been very helpful to me to kind of understand what your priorities are, and so I think it gives some real-time
Great.
chance for you guys to have feedback, and
Always love your reports,
Yeah,
John.
we really appreciate it, John. Thank you.
thank you, nice to see you again.
All right, you too. Thanks, John. All right.
Thank you.
No, that's, yeah, Barbara. Come on.
And that brings us to,
What?
I'm just going to,
We're going to see your report now in the agenda?
hang on one second here. Yep. We're going to do your report, Jack. The we're at item 11. Those of you keeping score at home.
We're at 9.
We just need to get through just two quick things, and then we'll take it, because we have just two things, and then we're done in closed session.
It's 9 and 11.
So we'll take a break, okay? Hang in there.
It's
I know.
after school.
I know. I know.
Thank you. Gotta move it up.
Trust me. I'm like,
Thank you. There we are. We're almost done.
Jack?
Just on the
some
CEO
of us.
report, the most important item is missing because it happened since we wrote the report. And the good news is, which we shared with Sharon and Harry just a day ago, is that we do have the final pricing on the headquarters expansion. So so it's called, of course, the GMP is the acronym for Guaranteed Maximum Price. And that's on the hard costs of the building. It's not the soft costs, but it's the construction part of the building. So remember, we started with this building with a concept and a thoughts on design and put the detail to it, but we also were very fearful of rising labor costs and inflation and competition for labor out in the community, and hoping that this came in within the budget you approved at $300 million. So the GMP is $248 million, which is great. The additional soft costs, and soft costs are not small either. They're at $44 million. There are things like the architect's fees, which are about $12 million. Your permitting fees were about $8 million. Your construction management, which is $5 million. Your furniture. So that gets up to about $44 million. So we have in there a contingency now, an owner's contingency of just under $8 million, which we're comfortable with. So the punchline of all that is the $300 million that you approved is the right number. And, you know, we see no risk at this point that there be any adjustments in this budget. And I know that some of you were skeptical that this would be the right budget, but it is the right budget.
Former board members were skeptical.
Yeah.
You should tell.
Right. You need to tell
I'll
a few,
bring out my
you need to
wallet.
take that message
Tell
back to a few.
Tell
Okay.
him.
Tell
Tell him.
All right.
He did not believe.
I'm coming over to Department of Finance myself and. And then the only other thing.
I agree. I agree.
That's right. The only thing is we met with Larry Jensen as well when going over these numbers, our chief auditor, and we're going to go ahead and commence an audit just of our process payments to make sure that everything is right as we start to process money through this accounts and everything. We did that on this building as well, right at the beginning to make sure everybody knew what their roles were and make sure there aren't any audit exceptions around the payment process. So Larry will do that for us in the relatively soon future, and we'll make sure everything's right going forward. And Julie, anything more on bond financing you want to share to them? You're spending a lot of time on it. We're getting to the finish line on that too.
Yes, we are officially a green bond.
Yay.
Love it. Yay. Awesome.
Yep.
Great.
So when the finish line is in December. So that means when you come back, we've gotten through the bond financing piece of this.
That's great.
We really are getting through the hurdles well. So, you know, the construction oversight manager told me not to say this to you, but it's going well. It's going very well. And, you know, they go like this and they're worried that, but it is going well.
Right.
But I will certainly share with you the bumps if we have some coming forward.
Congratulations.
Great. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Anything else?
It's just a draft agenda. It's actually, if you notice on that item, it's actually very slim. The item of a focus is the one that Rick Reed and David spoke to you about already. So that's going to, I'm trying to get there as the agenda. Remember, I think we wrote you a note. The meeting really does fit well within 2 days, even with the investments having, we're thinking about a 4 to 5 hour agenda.
What time is the Thursday?
And you pick Thursday and Friday.
Okay.
And so we'll have comp committee plus investments probably, and then we've got another committee and the board, and we should be fit nicely in 2 days. But as you can see, let's review the actuarial assumptions. We of course have the pension solution project like always, and federal state legislation update and the calendar. So, I know some of you have been, because you book so far in ahead, like we all do, I know you want to get that calendar for next year in place. So I'll do a draft here in a few weeks with Sharon and Harry and get that together for you. I might even mail it out ahead of time. Just, it's so hard to do this in a board meeting, like, no, that day doesn't work for me. Yeah, it does and stuff, just to see, are we close? But is there any feedback you wanted from people right now that would help us shape it or anything, just so I know it, or?
You're talking about the calendar for
2021,
2021, right? Yeah, I think, and just talking to Jack a little bit this morning, I'm gonna propose or throw out the idea of maybe trying to do all day Wednesday, all day Thursday, when we have the big board meetings, the 3-day, to have a full day Wednesday, full day Thursday, and kind of committees on Friday morning. I'm just noticing, like, even today, we get attrition like around 2:30. And just wanting to kind of make sure, especially like today is a closed session, we have a couple items that I want to make sure, it's great to have all the board members participate in some of those items, so I'm just wondering if maybe retooling that a little bit, plus Los Angeles and traffic and everyone else's lives on Friday night, maybe that might be a little more accommodating to people. So unless there's a problem with maybe reordering that for the 2021 year.
Does Sarah still want to do investment on the one
Yeah,
day,
so
on a certain day?
Oh, you mean
Why
for the
don't-
rest
why
of,
don't
from
you let
now
us-
till June? Yeah, it's
Why don't you
all,
let us talk to you, Harry and I can talk to you more about that, because I just want to make sure since Harry's not here, the schedule will work, because I think he's got family, kids and stuff, so figuring that out, but I think we could certainly talk about it.
And does that mean that Friday would then potentially be half-day? Because you just have
Correct.
committee
So we'd
review?
probably do investments Wednesday, regular board meeting, and maybe some committees on Thursday, and then a few committees on Friday morning or appeals. We'll talk more, but that's kind of just in concept, maybe an idea for next year, if that works for people.
Because that's what Harry wanted on the certain day, right, as
I think he
pay
wants a
for it.
time certain for investments. I think the bigger question is Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, because we made decisions this year to accommodate that, and we just want to make sure moving forward, so. And the only other comment I'd make about the January agenda is I think I want to talk with Amy a little bit more and maybe Cassandra about the compensation conversation we just had, and maybe if that fits better in the regular board meeting in January instead of in the comp committee, since there was a lot of conversation and we didn't, it just seems like there's probably more conversation to have and it maybe fits better in the regular board meeting than in comp. Just a suggestion, so maybe we can chat more offline about that. All right?
Yep.
Does that sound good?
yeah.
Brian, on item 12, the disclosure of incentives, that's a consent item. So people have that in their record. It's a consent information item. We did, you don't have to vote on things, that's an information item, so. And we did 13. Are there any items referred to by committee for board decision? New business, info requests, didn't hear any, Jennifer. Okay, and then opportunities for the statements from the public. Okay, all right, so I think, so we are adjourned from open session. And we do have just a few, if you can just bear with us, we have a few items for closed session, and I think we'll are we gonna head in the back for that? Yeah. So we have a cybersecurity item, we have another item with Brian, and then we're gonna have a couple other little items to chat. So we should be done in, I'd say, 45 minutes or so. So for open session, I know I shouldn't put a time frame on it, huh? That's jinxing it. But anyway, to the rest of you that came, we really appreciate your participation and coming to our board meetings, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
For board members, we'll just take a quick 5-minute break and then head into the back room and finish our open session or closed session items.